If you felt stuck trying to lose weight, you're not alone. Enter Weight Loss by Hers. It's designed to support you in reaching your goals. And Hers now offers access to an affordable range of FDA-approved GLP-1 medications, including the Wegovy pill and the Wegovy pen. With Wegovy at Hers, lose up to 20% or more of your body weight when combined with diet and exercise. It helps you regulate your appetite, eat less, and keep weight off. Plus, Wegovy is the first GLP-1 available in a pill, so there are no needles needed. Everything is 100% online through Hers. You'll connect with a licensed provider who will determine if treatment is right for you. If prescribed, your medication is delivered right to your door. No insurance necessary. And it doesn't stop there. Weight Loss by Hers goes beyond medication by offering access to 24/7 messaging with your care team and tons of in-app lifestyle and nutrition tips like recipes, meal plans, fitness videos, sleep content, and more. Even better, with a range of affordable GLP-1 options, Hers makes it simple to find an approach that fits your needs and your budget if eligible. You'll get a treatment plan personalized to you and unlimited dosage changes as needed. It's weight loss designed to work with your life. Ready to reach your goals? Visit forhers.com/women to get personalized, affordable care that gets you. That's forhers.com/women. forhers.com/women. Weight Loss by Hers is not available in all 50 states. Wegovy is the registered trademark of Novo Nordisk A/S. To get started and learn more, including important safety information, Wegovy clinical study information, and restrictions, visit forhers.com.
Picture this. Veteran lifter with 3 weeks of stalled squats. Nothing is moving on the bar. He's been sleeping enough, eating enough protein, and running a program that's produced gains for the last few months. So he starts hunting for what's broken. More volume, different exercises, maybe a different program altogether. Maybe, he tells himself, he's hit the intermediate to advanced transition and he needs a change. Across the gym from him is a brand new lifter on his 6th week of training. He's just added 30 pounds to his squat, and everyone says that he's a beast. He gets told to add weight every single session because that's just what novices do. The connective tissue in his knees, however, they've not been informed. Now, those two lifters are running on the same physiology. Both have the same 4 adaptive systems doing the same work, pointed in the same direction. The difference between them comes down to how long each of them has to wait before the work that they're doing shows up on the bar. And if you confuse the wait time for a category, you start solving for the wrong problem. The 4-year lifter ends up switching off a program that actually was working, and the new lifter ends up pushing ahead of what his tendons can absorb and maybe getting hurt. This week on the Barbell Medicine Podcast, why the novice, intermediate, advanced framework describes a measurement window more than it describes biology, and what to do instead. We're going to walk through nearly 10,000 competitive powerlifters tracked across more than 15 years of data. We're going to look at why a $1,200 withdrawal from a $1,000 bank account is the actual mechanism behind your buddy's first bout of patellar tendinopathy. And we're going to land on what a real stall looks like and what to do when you see one. Today is the mechanism layer, why those categories exist, what they actually tell you, and why most of what actually gets called a stall isn't really a stall. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, and this is the Barbell Medicine Podcast. And to help me explain why moving on to your 4th different program of the year is not the move, it's the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. What's going on, man?
Hey, I'm doing all right. It's an interesting way to think about things, the way you said it there, because I'm trying to think back, like, when was the last time that I thought in my own training that I was, like, quote unquote, doing a program? I feel like I have just allowed my training setup and my own programming to kind of ebb and flow with my goals and priorities and needs and limitations and aches and pains. And it's just kind of like in this perpetual state of evolution with much less of a sense of like, I'm on a discrete program for a discrete period of time, which I guess is different if you have like competitive like landmarks that you're working towards a meet and then you pivot off of it. But it's been a little while since I've, competed in powerlifting, but just thinking about discrete programs is something that's like been a little bit foreign to me for a while, just because of the nature of what my goals have been like in flux for the past year or so, I guess.
Yeah, we could go full meta on this and be like, what defines a program?
True.
Like if you change the split, if you change the frequency, whatever, like
it's the ship of Theseus, except as it pertains to a training program. If you swap out one variable at a time, at one point, is it a new program? Yeah.
Yeah. What defines that's my whole thing with what is CrossFit, what is 5-3-1, when you actually talk about these things. But yeah, to your point, if you look at in our app, I think I'm on my 28th block that I've programmed for myself.
Mm-hmm.
I would say, rough estimation, that 2/3 of those are the same program, just tweaked, right? It's like not AI kind of using feedback to do it. It's human intelligence, doing a lot of heavy
What a
lifting.
Concept. Yeah.
Yeah, right. But yeah, is it a different program? And so anyway, yeah, there are certainly people listening to this, hopefully, who are newly discovering us, and they may in fact be on their second brand new program, third program, fourth program of the year. They're just moving on because it's stall or whatever. And so we're going to talk about why that may not be the move and how you think about different categorizations for people in training may be mistaken. So 2 terms will do most of the heavy lifting today. Untrained, meaning less than roughly a year of consistent, progressively loaded exercise. I should also note that this is mode specific. So someone can be untrained in cardiorespiratory fitness or cardio conditioning training, and somebody could be trained in resistance training and vice versa. So we have untrained and then trained. It's everyone else. If you've been training for more than a year in a particular modality, we call you trained. Less than that, we call you untrained. Just this sort of arbitrary line in the sand that we've drawn. And the whole premise of the rest of this podcast, and if you want to tune out after this, please don't. But if you want to, none of this stuff really matters. These terms, that, and then what we'll contrast that against, novice, intermediate, advanced, doesn't matter. So we're going to drop novice, intermediate, and advanced for most of the rest of this episode. Those labels are in heavy rotation for coaches as a rough heuristic, but they describe mostly a measurement window more than they describe anything physiological, biological, etc. And we're going to spend the next approximately 60 minutes explaining why. Now, underneath these labels, there are 4 adaptive systems that are doing the work, and that they're the same at month 1 as they are at year 1 as they are at year 10. None of them switch off. None of them hand the work off to a different system. None of them transition into a new system at any boundary that this novice, intermediate, advanced framework draws. They run continuously across a training career across 4 different time scales, and the time scales are most of what the novice, intermediate, advanced system gets wrong. So the 4 systems that we're going to come back to for the rest of this podcast. One is neural. So neural adaptation. This is the fastest. We're talking about recruitment threshold reductions, firing rate increases, antagonist suppression. We can detect this really in hours, days, weeks. Muscle hypertrophy is slower than the neural adaptation, driven primarily by mechanical tension on the muscle. This is usually detectable in weeks to months. Then we'll talk about connective tissue, meaning tendons, ligaments. This is the slowest of these sort of fast adapting systems. We're talking about 6 to 8 weeks minimum to detect changes in stiffness, longer when it comes to actual size or cross-sectional area of these tissues. And then bone is remodeling in the background. A complete remodeling of bone cycle takes 3 to 6 months with DEXA detectable changes, that's X-ray technology, needing maybe 6 to 12 months of consistent loading to show up. So the novice, intermediate, advanced framework has 3 claims, which we're going to basically test against the data. Claim 1 is that novice, intermediate, and advanced lifters have different rates at which these underlying adaptive processes function. The cell biology is supposedly running at different speeds in these groups. That's claim 1. Claim 2, the rate differences dictate a different progression model. Novices add weight to the session, each session, because their biology has facilitated it. Intermediates add weight weekly, and advanced lifters add weight each month or longer, again, because of these different adaptation rates. And claim 3, that program design differs by category. Advanced lifters need different volume, different intensity ranges, different exercise selection compared to novices. And, this neat categorization system kind of tells you how to do that. It's prescriptive in a way. 3 claims, each of which is testable. Now, Austin, before we get into the data, where do you see this novice, intermediate, advanced framework pay off? And where do you see it cause trouble? Because I imagine you've seen 2 sides of this.
Yeah, I think we both have. I mean, if you see that label applied to a person, the intent of it, I think that is, I don't know, will be most charitable to, is that it gives you just like a very general sense of how long has this person been at it? If anything, it doesn't actually tell you like how much adaptation they have actually gained, because they're, both of us have worked with clients, for example, who come in relatively new to the game and, really early on, they identify themselves as like kind of a bit of a freak of nature, and they tend to get real strong real fast. And others who have been training for a very long period of time and struggling to add some weight. And so you can't necessarily make that determination based on just like actually how strong someone is necessarily. And so more so, I think you're kind of onto something in terms of like attaching these to some general sense of how long has the person been at this? How long have they kind of been in the iron game working at improving these adaptations? Where have things kind of gone wrong, or where we've seen it cause trouble is when people take this very clearly oversimplified framework and use it to make very concrete decisions for their own training or for their clients' training, meaning that they are kind of forcing a square peg into a round hole, saying, I have deemed you to be an intermediate, for example, and therefore you must add weight every week because that is what defines an intermediate. And it's like, that's not the direction that this relationship should go. Instead of me deeming you an intermediate, therefore your next week must be, a certain increment in weight heavier than this week, I should more so observe your response and use that to inform my like assessment of kind of where you're at in your training journey. And so it can ultimately lead people to make somewhat foolish or sometimes very foolish decisions when it comes to their load selection and expectations of progression, if they are trying to force themselves into a particular category. The last thing is, you pointed out these different systems, the neurological system, muscle, connective tissue, bone, and that is itself also a bit of an oversimplification, as are many things that we describe here, in the sense that it's not just those four systems that determine your performance on any given day, right? We also need, this nebulous concept that we talk about. The stars need to align in various ways: your psychology, your readiness, your alertness, your preparedness. And so whether or not you're able to increment the load or demonstrate and improve performance on a particular timeline is still not even determined purely by, adaptation rates in those four systems. So these things are just a lot more complex. And so that is part of why I think observing the person's response and being a little bit more kind of reactive to that, rather than imposing a particular rate of progression on somebody based on where you have like labeled them, makes more sense. I am curious though, we have touched on this topic. You're calling this progressive loading number 3. So we've touched on it at least 2 times before. And outside of the fact that our audience is growing and we may have some new people here, why did you feel this needed another treatment today?
Yeah, I think in the first section, we kind of talked about that progressive overload, the word itself was doing, and again, to use this pun, how many more times will I use it? Some heavy lifting. Where people were saying, if it's overloading, it has to be more than what I can currently tolerate. And so what we really wanted to introduce in part 1 is that the concept of progressive overload is probably better framed through the term progressive loading, in that it is reactive to how the person is actually adapting, and to the extent those adaptations are more detectable above the sort of noise that we see in day-to-day performance. And once that happens, you should add weight, you should add reps, you should add pace, duration, whatever, right? So that was like part 1. It's like the word's probably wrong. If you look at it through this different lens, your training decisions become reactive. That was like part 1. Part 2 was more of a historical thing, like how did we get here? And addition, how to detect those adaptations when they do clear that sort of noise range. So kind of a practical how-to. And this hopefully final one, I do love
I hope so.
is more so of like, why do people get this wrong? Like, what is the source of that? And if it's not just the word, and I do think that the framing, novice, intermediate, advanced, is the crux of most of that. And to your point, all models have problems, right? And I think the issue here is the more literally somebody adopts this novice, intermediate, advanced, right, and says, this is it, the worse it serves them. If the novice, intermediate, advanced model just said, look, as you become more trained, the amount of demonstrable improvements of performance are going to be less and less over time, we wouldn't be making this episode. The problem is when that extends to prescription, whether it's prescription of progression, like you have to add weight every session, You have to add weight every week or every month or whatever. And then subsequently program design. You can give an experienced trainee and an unexperienced trainee the same program, right? And if the training load happens to match both of them, you're going to see great progress. If it happens to match neither of them, you could see bad progress or no progress. And so the point is, like, you can't tell what type of program somebody needs just based on if they're classified as novice, intermediate, advanced, especially if those categories are based on how often they can add weight. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I felt like this episode needed to be made. Also, we haven't talked about training in a while, so we get to double dip.
People dig the training episodes. I get that.
That's right. Okay. So if this novice, intermediate, and advanced framework's first claim is right, that novices and advanced lifters are running biologically different adaptive processes, then we should be able to see that in some data. Specifically, if the rate of underlying adaptation actually changes when a lifter crosses the threshold from novice to intermediate, the strength curve over a long career should show that change. Now, one of the largest data sets that we have on this was published in Sports Medicine in 2024. This is Christopher Latella and colleagues at Edith Cowan University in Australia, working with collaborators at 2 other universities. They took the largest publicly available powerlifting data set from Open Powerlifting and asked a simple question. If you follow each lifter's competition results over years, what does the curve of their strength gain actually look like? They had nearly 10,000 lifters with up to 17 years of data. So they had some room to find an answer. So in total, 9,259 unique lifters pulled from the International Powerlifting Federation, IPF, database. These are all in the open class, raw competition only, drug-tested federations. These lifters had at least 3 competitions on record. The maximum window in the data set is about 17 years. Now, when I say open class, there are some masters lifters that had signed up for both meets, so you're getting that data there too. They modeled each lifter's squat, bench press, deadlift, and total as a function of years in the sport while accounting for age, sex, and body weight. The model lets you see the average rate of strength gain across a competitive career. So the greatest gains were in the first year. No surprise there, roughly 7.5% to 12.5% above baseline in the first year, and then up to 20% above baseline after 10 years. Now, the curve here is smooth and like an asymptote. The curve climbs hard in year 1, it bends and keeps flattening out over the next decade. Each year adds less than the year before. Same general shape across squat, bench press, and deadlift. So what's this mean? You could read this finding and conclude something like this. The framework says novices and advanced lifters are running biologically different adaptive processes. If that's right, then at the moment a lifter crosses from novice to intermediate, something physiological is supposed to shift. And if something physiological shifts, the strength curve should show it as a bend, an inflection point, a visible change in slope at that point. And there isn't one. So the framework's wrong. And that argument, though, to me, is probably too strong. Before we get into why, we need to introduce an alternative explanation, the case that we're going to be making for the rest of this podcast. Picture a lifter as somebody working with the same biological machinery their whole training career. They've got the same muscle protein synthesis pathway, the same neural recruitment hardware, the same connective tissue remodeling cycle. And so what changes across years of training isn't the machinery. What changes is how much room is left between where the lifter is and their ceiling, their genetics, their training history, and their life circumstances that all allow on top of that. So in year 1, the room is huge, gap is huge. In year 10, the gap is small. It's the same machinery, just less remaining room. That's the sort of alternative hypothesis. And both that story and the framework's biology shifts modes story produce the same sort of logarithmic curve.
This brings something to mind, if I can insert a little comment here, because it made me think of something else as an analogy or like a similar related situation. We're viewing this person, this biological organism, and then delivering an intervention to them. And the intervention is their training program. And the training program or the training intervention will evolve over the course of their career. Most of the time, the dose of training will tend to increase over the course of the career. And yet we see this kind of long-term, as you described, like a logarithmic kind of plateau over long enough periods of time. And because of the visual that evoked in my mind of that type of a graph, I'm like, I've seen very similar graphs just like that very recently. in the realm of GLP-1 mediated weight loss data, right? So we have a human with a particular underlying biology, genetics, environmental conditions, things like that. And if you look at the randomized trials of these medications, for example, as they get administered to a person at each given dose, right? There's an initial relatively quick weight loss, and then it slows down, and then it plateaus. And if you increase the dose, then that initial curve steepens a little bit, and then it plateaus at a little bit further lower weight level, and all the way up to the maximum dose where there are diminishing returns, but that plateau happens a little bit later and later and later. And so you have this intervention being delivered at a progressively increasing dose to a person with underlying biology, genetics. You have a pretty substantial initial response, depending on where their biological and environmentally determined like ceiling is. And then long term, always plateaus, right? There are no humans who are like on these medicines or using these interventions really, or any other, who just like perpetually lose weight forever, in the same way that no one pursuing this kind of intervention perpetually gains strength forever. So it's a really kind of analogous situation, a biology and environmentally determined kind of ceiling potential. And then as your intervention, as it evolves over time, you approach that, of course, at a diminishing rate, but that ceiling is there. And the underlying kind of physiology, the processes aren't like shifting gears or changing. They're just responding with less and less and less room to go. And then you're inevitably going to plateau at some level over a long enough time span.
Yeah. No, that's pretty elegant. I think maybe if you're like a NIA, novice, intermediate, advanced hardliner, and you accept all three of these arguments, this first one is the easiest to reject. That the biological processes, the physiology that's going on underneath the hood is changing. And it's like, probably not. And we don't really see that in a lot of other circumstances too. Now, two caveats to the study that I just presented. One, lifters cross these sort of category boundaries theoretically at different times. And so when you aggregate thousands of lifters together, these individual transitions would average out into a smooth curve. So if there were like sharp individual transitions, you might miss that. That said, think about what the framework, this NIA framework, actually prescribes. Novice adds weight every session, intermediate adds weight every week, and advanced lifter adds weight some time course longer than that. That's a prescription for what the coach does, not necessarily a claim about how fast the cells are dividing or how fast the protein synthesis machinery is firing. And a curve produced by that prescription applied to a lifter who is approaching their genetic ceiling looks identical to this curve produced by the same machinery, less remaining room argument that we're making. Both produce the same shape and the data can't really tell them apart. So maybe this is supporting both arguments. But to me, what we can tell from this is that the shape of long-term strength gain looks like an asymptote with diminishing returns. The specific numbers are 7.5% to 12.5% strength gain in year one and up to 20% after a decade. Oh, and resistance training across the lifespan attenuates or reduces age-related decline substantially. That data set also shows that. Two more findings from the paper before we move on, because they also run counter to some popular claims. First up is sex. Females in this data set showed significantly steeper gains as a percentage of baseline gain compared to males. Now, the authors attribute this to a lower starting strength and lower prior training experience on average. Females, perhaps entering powerlifting, come in less pre-trained than the dude on average, so they have more available room above baseline to gain into, which neatly supports our hypothesis here. But this is not a categorical sex difference in adaptive capacity. But when someone tells you that women can't get strong or they lack the machinery or whatever, the largest data set says that we have the opposite. Also, the master's findings that I alluded to. Females above age 59 still showed positive strength gains across the data collection window. And males above 69 showed a slight decline, about 0.35% per year. Now, if you compare that to what happens in the gen pop, people who aren't exercising, the strength decline at that age is closer to 1% per year. So masters powerlifters are losing strength roughly a third as fast as their non-training peers. That's the resistance training protects against aging finding, demonstrated cleanly in this 17-year competition data set. So Austin, for a lifter who comes in and they're frustrated that they only added 5 pounds to their squat in the last 3 months, after adding 50 pounds in their first 3 months, they're more experienced now. What's the conversation like, and how do you keep them training instead of program hopping out of impatience?
Yeah. Part of this involves getting a little bit more background information on their training history and what their kind of expectations have been if that is in fact the case, those numbers that you laid out, there's actually a good chance that, they started out, as most people, tending to start out like well below their absolute strength potential on day one. In other words, your early progress might be kind of artificially inflated, because it's not like you're working up to your, 5 rep max on your first day ever training, and then that's what improves by 50 pounds over the subsequent couple months. Most of the time you're starting a little bit artificially light, and then you're kind of, developing your neurological adaptations, your technique, your proficiency, your consistency, getting over the early soreness and things like that. And so that early perceived rate of progress might be like artificially fast. And so this might not actually be that as dramatic of a quote unquote slowdown as it seems. But if the person's expectations were that they were going to have, linear progress for a very, very, very long period of time, it might be time for maybe a hard conversation about those types of expectations. Now, I am also going to be taking a history on like, well, what does your training look like? And how to, what is the nature of the stimulus that you've been delivering to yourself? And then what if the rest of your life looked like outside of the gym, kind of the recovery aspect, the sleep aspect, the nutrition things, all the things that we know go into generating these adaptations. Sometimes it's a matter of, oh, this person had some massive life stressors or job changes or various other things, and they're wanting the progress to continue, but it might not be physiologically realistic or feasible for them. So, getting a sense of where they're coming from, what they've been doing, where their potential gaps in their game might be, and kind of helping to reframe expectations. I don't necessarily like the idea of like aggressively resetting expectations, like telling them that all your expectations are just like, we need to throw them away, because that's also a way to like lose somebody, but just kind of gently, collaboratively massaging those expectations, I would say, to be more in line with either, kind of like average data that we're familiar with, but also recognizing that like, data are not you, the individual, right? Those might give us some like kind of general expectations, but at the same time, some people are going to be, above that, and some people are going to be below it. And more so at this point, we need to just treat you as an individual based on what you're showing us, rather than, setting expectations based on how somebody else has responded to training.
Yeah. Well said. And I think the program hopping thing, it's, I struggle with this because it's like, again, what defines a program, and like, when would I definitively recommend somebody change a program versus not? And it's like, if the bones of your program, the reps, the sets, the exercise selection, the total amount of volume, proximity to failure, all these sort of variables are reasonable, I don't know that you need a complete program change, right? And when I say reasonable, I mean match you, the individual, your current fitness level, your resources that you have, so on and so forth, right? If they're not producing the gains that you want, I have less concerns about the sort of formulation of the program and more about the dosing, right? Is that more appropriate for you? But I do see a lot of bad programs. Like, it just where almost everything is wrong, and anchoring to that particular setup and just tweaking from there is more headache than it's worth. And that's kind of how I feel about the various 5-3-1 permutations, for example. Like, yeah, maybe it was more outspoken previously about 5-3-1 or whatever, but I'm like, I don't know that we need to anchor to what is maybe fundamentally 5-3-1, like changing the rep scheme on a weekly basis or whatever, or even anchoring to 5s, 3s, and 1s. Like, why are we doing this? And I feel similarly about other programming styles, but if somebody came up to me and they were like, look, it's an upper-lower split, and here's the total training load, and I'm mostly doing strength work, I want to get stronger, and I'm like, well, this setup seems, the bones are fine, I would want to iteratively change from there. And like, what constitutes, well, now this is a program change. Like, again, this meta conversation about what is a real change versus just like a tweak. I don't know.
Sure. I have two thoughts. And one of them is a little bit of a pushback and to see your thoughts on like a defense of program hopping, so to speak. I mean, depending on the person's goals, obviously from the start, let's say somebody's goals are purely health related, honestly, program hop away. In my opinion, that you are sufficiently active with sufficient, level of effort on a sufficiently regular basis, I'm like, you're good with the vast majority. Go ahead.
The only caveat I would make to that is that we know that exercise works better when it works for you. So that it's not just the participation per se. That is like the main thing, maybe 80% of the thing. The remaining 20% is like, it should probably still be making you a little stronger. Should be gaining a little bit of muscle mass, getting fitter cardiovascular fitness wise. But outside of that, yes, correct. I'm like unconcerned. If it makes you happy and you're going to keep doing it, do it.
Yeah. If somebody does have performance-oriented goals, then obviously the question of specificity comes into play as far as what their program should kind of start to prioritize a little bit more. But even then, I can see a degree of like an argument for some amount of program hopping. And the way I'm thinking about this is twofold, I think. One is going back to our prior discussions on like long-term athletic development and how early on in the training lifespan or somebody's training career, sampling can be beneficial for a lot of different reasons. And you think about like the youth kind of recruitment methods that are used, I don't know, I think in like China or something to develop their Olympic athletes, and they just like bounce them around between different sports to find something that they're good at, and then they select for that. And so that's like the more extreme version where you're literally changing between entirely different disciplines. Although, you know, there's also even an argument for that, in terms of improving being associated with improved outcomes in single sport athletes down the line is those who have participated in more things early on, although there's a lot of caveats to that type of interpretation. And then the other thing is even within a narrower range of specificity, not to say that you should be bouncing between powerlifting and weightlifting and then basketball and pickleball and swimming and things like that to get better at 1RM deadlift strength. But even within a narrower band of specificity, like quote unquote program hopping within the strength training realm, you may happen upon something that either clicks with your psychology a bit better, gets you motivated, gets you training harder in a way that leads to some better outcomes, or just find something that maybe physiologically resonates or works better for you, your physiology, your, I don't know, tissue tolerance, recovery capacity, whatever the case is. And so some maybe moderate amount of program hopping, if it was to happen, that might be a reasonable time to do it, kind of a more of a sampling exploratory phase earlier on. I could see an argument for that instead of rigidly adhering to like, this has to be the best method for, everyone who is at this stage of training or who falls under this, like call it a novice, intermediate, advanced type label. Again, an example of like, forcing a square peg into a round hole, like forcing the client onto the program or the trainee onto the program instead of saying like, we have a lot of options out there. And then there are some people who maybe are going to do great with like a double progression type setup and that gets them motivated. Other people who are really going to enjoy AMRAPs, other people who are going to enjoy some aspect of the 5-3-1, maybe somebody else who instead of that enjoys, the Fibonacci sequence program where you use different numbers instead of 5 and 3 and 1. I don't know. So that's kind of a thought that I'm curious what your take would be.
Yeah, again, I think it just comes back to a definition like what is fundamentally different program. Like when I think about a strength program, right? It's like a pretty wide range of things that I would consider viable for that goal if we're talking about 1 rep max strength. And so like if you go from primarily you're training in the 6 to 8 rep range, right? Versus primarily training the 1 to 3 rep range. Well, both are like in this sort of strength training realm. Are they different programs, right? Or if one program uses double progression. Another one is more like repeat sets or percentages. Like, are these different programs or just slight tweaks? And so again, the definition matters. If you're calling those program hops, like exploring different setups, I'm with you 1,000%. Yeah. If it's more like, okay, this is definitively like strength, and now we've moved so far from that, it's hypertrophy, and we're doing that for strength gain, then I'm less inclined to agree. And so I think that's more what I'm getting at. Now, again, all of this is to say, the training, the formulation of the training needs to be relevant to your goals. And if that is out of place or the setup that you've anchored yourself to is so rigid that it cannot adapt to you, then I'm in full favor of let's do a full rewrite. Mm-hmm. But otherwise I'm kind of like, I don't know, a lot of programs are reasonable, like starting points, and then tweaking from there is kind of the general thing that we're doing here. Does that seem like something you'd agree with?
Fair enough.
Yeah, I talked enough that you got to agree with it. It makes sense. So the curve on its own does not kill the framework's biology claim. The same shape is produced by both stories. The NIA framework's biology shifts modes, and the same machinery, less remaining room story, well, it's the same curve. Both produce an asymptote with diminishing returns, and the data on its own can't tell them apart. Where the framework actually breaks down is one level below. When you walk through what each of the 4 adaptive systems is actually doing across the training career, the cell biology is the same in the new lifter and the 4-year lifter. What's different is how much room is left to adapt on each system and how long each one takes to register a change. That's the next 30 minutes of this episode. We'll walk through them fastest to slowest, and for each one, we'll talk about the mechanism, the timeline, and the limit. So let's start off with the neurological adaptations. Now, the nervous system recruits the muscle through a relatively strict hierarchy called the size principle, Henneman's size principle. At low force demands, the smallest, most fatigue-resistant motor units fire first. As force demand increases, larger, fast-twitch motor units come on. The order doesn't change with training. What training changes is the efficiency of the entire process. Lower thresholds to reach those sort of high force motor units, faster firing rates, better coordination between muscles pulling in the same direction, more complete suppression of the muscles that would otherwise oppose the movement. So picture a single nerve cell connected to a small group of muscle fibers. This bundle is what physiologists call a motor unit, and every contraction is the sum of all of the motor units firing. The bigger the load, the more motor units the nervous system has to recruit, and the faster each one has to fire. Del Vecchio and colleagues in 2019 had untrained subjects strength train for 4 weeks. They measured what each motor unit was doing before and after using a technique called high-density EMG that picks up the electrical sort of signature of individual motor units rather than averaging them across the whole muscle. After 4 weeks, the motor units fired faster, and the motor units that previously only came online at high efforts were now showing up at a lower effort. It's the same hardware, but better software. And that's what people mean, I think, when they say the first month of training, those gains are mostly neural. The lifter hasn't really grown any more muscle, not appreciably so anyway. The lifter got better at using the muscle they already had. But long term, this sort of story is incomplete. So picture what happens when you try to extend your knee. Your quadriceps on the front of your thigh has to fire. Your hamstrings on the backside of your leg have to relax. If both fired at the same time, the leg doesn't go anywhere. Every coordinated movement requires the muscles on one side of a joint to get out of the way of the muscles on the other side. Now, the spinal cord handles that coordination through a sort of reflex circuit. When a motor signal from the brain goes out to the quadriceps, the same circuit sends an inhibitory signal to the hamstrings, telling them to back off. 2 synapses, one signal pulls the trigger, one signal lifts the brake. Now, a 2025 review by Lecce and colleagues in the Journal of Physiology pulls the data together on what training does to that circuit, technically called disynaptic reciprocal inhibition. You can use that at the bar later to impress somebody. Long-term strength athletes show that brake lifting signal more strongly and faster than recreationally active people do. In a trained lifter, the quad fires harder because the hamstrings get out of the way more completely. A larger fraction of what the muscle could produce actually reaches the bar, the machine, the dumbbell, whatever. Now, adaptations like that take years to develop. They cannot be attributed to muscle size alone either. The trained lifter isn't just stronger because the muscle is bigger, but rather the trained lifter is stronger because the wiring around that muscle is better tuned, better coordinated. Now, we got to do a few caveats, as we're wont to do here on the Barbell Medicine podcast. We're talking about EMG or electromyography. This picks up electrical activity that the muscle produces when it contracts. You stick electrodes on the skin over a muscle, you ask the lifter to do something, and the bigger the electrical signal, the more the muscle is firing. That's the sort of basic version here. Now, in a study from 2019 by Balshaw, they used EMG to compare 3 groups: untrained subjects, 12-week trained subjects, and a group that had been training consistently for 4 years. They looked at the electrical signal coming out of the working muscle when each group was pushed as hard as they could. The 4-year trained group's signal was 44% larger than the untrained groups. On the surface, that's a great version of the neural adaptation continues to make differences long after the first month. Bigger signal, more firing, stronger lifter. Unfortunately, it's not that clean. Scarabot and colleagues in 2021 ran a follow-up that exposed a problem with the measurement. Bigger muscles produce bigger EMG signals on their own. So when you correct for that, some of the 44% goes away. The signal that looked like neural adaptation was mostly just more muscle, in fact. Now, there are some neural adaptations that take place after the first year, but the magnitude is more modest than, that previous 44% number implied. The lifter at year 4 isn't dramatically better at firing the muscle than the lifter at month 3. They mostly just have more muscle to fire. So the point here is that the trained lifter and the untrained lifter aren't running different neural hardware. It's the same. But the 4-year lifter just has less room left to adapt because they're already further along. It's the same machinery with less remaining room, exactly what the curve predicts. Austin, is there anything practical a lifter can do to get more out of the sort of neural side, or is it mostly automatic once you're training consistently?
No, the cool thing is that there are things that you can do. The main one being that you can try. And that sounds like a simplification, which it is, but we know that at least on the concentric phase of your movement. So for example, when you're standing up out of the bottom of a squat, or you're pressing a bench press off of your chest, or you're lifting a deadlift up off the floor, that kind of muscle shortening phase to actually move the load. When that is done with maximum volitional intent, when you are trying as hard as you can to basically accelerate the bar as quickly as you can during that phase, even if you're lifting the same load, if you're doing that with maximum intent in that way, you actually get more adaptations out of the set and out of the training, compared with if you move the same load without doing that, and certainly more than if you deliberately slowed that component of the movement. And so I think that this is something that I have felt. I think one of the first times I felt it was definitely, when you're going for a load that you're not super certain that you're going to get early on in your training career, and you're like, oh, I'm really going to have to lock in on this and really, maximize my focus. But also when we've both dabbled with velocity-based training, where there are these kind of devices that you can attach to your bar and it'll measure your bar speed. And it almost gamified the experience of training in the sense of you wanting to hit not necessarily a certain number of reps or a certain weight, but rather for the weight that you were lifting, you wanted the device to measure the highest bar speed possible. And so I felt a little bit of a change in how I approached my lift, trying to accelerate things to maximize that speed. And then once I got the feel for how to do that, didn't end up needing the velocity device long term in order to continue doing that in training. And that ended up being super useful and something that I've often advised people to do. It's almost like you learn how to unlock a different, another level or an additional gear. I remember actually noticing the same thing back in my swimming days. I was face to face with a guy who I'd been going back and forth with as a rival for most of the season. And I was so pissed that I was I'm going to bury this guy. And I found in that race a new gear that I had never previously accessed before, even though it was the same race, same distance, same stroke. I felt like I was trying before, and I was trying certainly afterwards, but there was this additional gear that I discovered. And then from then on out, the rest of my training and my racing was fundamentally different. And the same applies in strength training. So this neurological aspect, even if the weight does not actually move very fast because it is very heavy, the kind of neurological recruitment that you have to do in order to try even harder to accelerate it will get you better adaptations than you would if you don't do that, and certainly better than if you moved it deliberately slowly with a concentric tempo.
Yeah. I think the way I think about those neurological adaptations is it's the software. If everything else is hardware, then this is software. And there are multiple ways to kind of update or upgrade your software, right? Unlock a new level, for example, or get a better processor. And so, trying hard, trying to move everything, particularly the concentric, as fast as possible. There's also some evidence on bringing the bar down faster on a bench press, for example, can be more useful for bench press strength, faster than you want to most of the time. But also just exposure to the test itself. There's sort of becoming more familiar with the test. We have pretty interesting data that people maxing out day after day after day after day after day after day continue to get stronger for a set period of time because they get better at the test, which is mostly neurological. They're not growing, more muscle mass at the time. They're becoming not only better coordinated, but also perhaps some other stuff, whether they're unlocking another gear or whatever. So you can get more out of this with some programming tweaks. But to your point, even if the program remains the same, trying as hard as you can on each rep, you're going to get more out of it, generally speaking. So those are neural adaptations. The same hardware is running in the new lifter as is in the 4-year lifter, with less remaining room to adapt in the experienced one. The frameworks claim that neural adaptation is a novice phase phenomenon, that hands off to hypertrophy after 6 weeks is the wrong story. The two overlap from session 1 and they continue across a training career. It's the same machinery the whole way through, with less and less remaining room as the training history accumulates. And that's the whole through line of this episode. Hypertrophy is next, and that's running on a slower clock than the neural side. The cleanest study on what early growth is actually made of is actually one of the most elegant things that I've ever read in this literature. Muscle growth happens when individual fibers add contractile protein, also non-contractile protein too. The muscle will grow. The primary driver here is mechanical tension, which kicks off the mTOR pathway, the mammalian target of rapamycin pathway, which drives muscle protein synthesis, and the muscle fibers will grow over weeks to months. The sort of contemporary or latest synthesis on what drives muscle growth is from Roberts and colleagues in 2023, published in the Physiological Reviews. A few popular ideas get dismantled there. 1, metabolic stress and muscle damage. They were once framed as these sort of independent drivers of muscle hypertrophy alongside mechanical tension, and they're now mostly understood as downstream correlates of the conditions that produce muscle growth, not independent causes. The second is this sort of post-exercise hormonal milieu, the hormone hypothesis. Your testosterone goes up, your growth hormone bumps every time you train, and supplement companies prey on this sort of understanding. Well, they don't predict hypertrophy or strength gains at any meaningful time scale. Mechanical tension does the work. The rest is the company you get to keep when you do the work right. Now, the study that earns its place in this particular segment, I think, because it changes how you should view hypertrophy, the timescales, and so on and so forth. This is from Damas and colleagues, and it's a deuterium oxide study. It was published in 2016 in the journal Physiology. They needed a way to measure how much new muscle protein their subjects were building across weeks of training while the subjects went about their normal lives. Now, most existing methods give you a single snapshot in time, which won't tell you what's actually accumulating across a training block or cycle. Now, deuterium is the heavy version of hydrogen. The same atom that's in regular water, it's just slightly heavier. Drink water with the heavy version in it for a few weeks and your body uses that heavy hydrogen to build new proteins, including new muscle. And you can then biopsy a small piece of the muscle, weigh how much heavy hydrogen got built into it, and that tells you how much new protein the muscle is laid down over the whole window. Untrained men, 10 weeks of training, and the researchers tracked muscle protein synthesis the entire time. Early in the training block, the muscle protein synthesis the lifter was generating wasn't correlating to actual muscle growth. It was correlating with markers of muscle damage, something like CK or creatine kinase. The body was building protein, but the protein was repair work, not growth, sort of just keeping your head above water, right? At week 10, once the body adapted to the training stimulus and stopped treating each session as a sort of novel insult, the same muscle protein synthesis started correlating with actual growth. The relationship was pretty tight. The R value was 0.94. It's the same machinery the entire time. The body just stopped using it for repair only and got to use it now for building. This was also reflected on imaging studies. So the thigh cross-sectional area, the thigh size at week 3, what you see when you take a selfie in the mirror. Well, this was up 3 to 4% at week 3. But most of that wasn't new muscle. It was fluid the body sent to the area to deal with the training-induced muscle damage, basically inflammation. The thigh got bigger due to that inflammation. Now, at week 10, the thigh size was up 7 to 10%, with most of the inflammation resolved. That's the real growth, and you should probably wait for the gym selfies at that point. The first 3 weeks of the I'm getting bigger sort of thing you might pick up is mostly water. So before you post those bathroom mirror progress shots, give it a minute. The caveats to this study, of course, as we do here on the podcast, it was untrained men, small sample. The exact percentages are population specific, but I think the principle still holds that early visible changes in muscle size mix repair with growth. But we already knew that trained lifters grow slower. That part's never really been in dispute. The question here is whether they grow slower because they've gotten closer to their ceiling and they have less remaining room, or is it because the underlying machinery has become less responsive per unit of training stimulus? And the current data sets that we have can't really tell which one it is. But why does this even matter, right? Well, the NIA's framework claims that advanced lifters need different programming, and that leans on the second answer being true. They're just less responsive. If the machinery has genuinely become less responsive, you need a different stimulus to get a response. If the machinery is the same and the sort of space between where you're at currently and your ceiling has just gotten smaller, you don't. You apply the same stimulus, you get a smaller response, and that's what the closing the distance to the ceiling actually looks like. So Austin, to me, I think that the window of what works and what you can tolerate just gets narrower. Something like the minimum effective dose of training load that you need to actually drive growth and the max recoverable training load, they get closer and closer and closer as people approach their ceiling. What do you think about that?
I think that's a reasonable kind of heuristic or a reasonable paradigm for this, that you are likely to need to do more, but you're going to start to bump up against some of those physiological limits. And there are ways, obviously beyond a certain point, that you can stretch your training tolerance. I think that both of us are able to sustain and tolerate quite high training loads. But if you asked us, in any given week or 2 weeks to bump up our training, load or overall training stress by, 10 or 15%, I don't think that we would feel awesome on the back end of that if that was done kind of all at once. And so we are, you're walking a finer and finer line to try to eke out, tinier and tinier increments of progress as you approach that ceiling. I think this is a reasonable way to look at it. And then the other thing is, fundamentally, if you examine, say, our training, trajectory over time that led up to our peak levels of performance, the nature of what that training looked like was not radically different. In other words, it's not, because that also further argues against some sort of like phased response where there's like biology kind of switching or becoming like dramatically more resistant to things. In general, we did similar styles of training over very long periods of time, and we continued responding. It was just slower. It wasn't that we, if the biological gear shifted and we're like, oh, now we need to switch to this, much different style of training. I remember, leading up to my all-time PRs on all the lifts, I think I ran the same, more or less the same weekly cycle for like over a year. And just kind of, as we've talked about, rode the wave where some weeks were a little stronger, some weeks were a little, down in performance. And then the net trend over a long enough time span was up and up and up and up until those PRs happened. And so it was just a matter of trying to find how to thread that needle of like finding a dose that I could tolerate that led to that response, and then just being patient and doing it day in and day out for like weeks and weeks and months and years and years.
Yeah, no, it makes sense to me. It corroborates my experience for sure, not only personally, but also professionally working with people. And I think, the listener is thinking, well, how come I can't make gains now? Or like that's the problem they want to solve at the end of the day. Now there's some ceiling, there's some max, right? And people don't like to think about that. They're like, what do you mean I'm limited? Is how much strength I can gain? I'm like, look, man, if there were no limits here, right? Shout out to Master P. That means that everyone would be able to theoretically squat 1,000 pounds or more, right? Or sure, everyone should be able to deadlift 700 pounds. And it's like, well, clearly that's not the case, right? There's some limit, and there's a lot of things that go into those limits. Now, one of them is modifiable to some extent, which is how much training load you're willing to expose yourself to. Mm-hmm. The upper limit there is, well, what can you actually tolerate, right? And so I think as you become more and more trained, those things become closer. Right. And so if you don't have the resources to train as much as you need to, well, that's problem number one. And then problem number two is if you do have those resources, at some point, you're not going to be able to recover from them anyway. Right. And so you get closer and closer to these things. These things get closer and closer together. And that's what produces that asymptote. That's how I think about it. It's the same answer in the muscle as in the nervous system. The same machinery is running in the new lifter and the 4-year lifter with less remaining room to adapt into as training history accumulates. The frameworks category-driven prescription is solving for a biology that isn't changing modes in the first place. Now to the system the framework gets most consequentially wrong, the one where the early training injury story actually lives, which is connective tissue. So tendons attach muscle to bone and transmit the force the muscle produces into actual joint movement. They adapt to mechanical loading the same way the rest of the system does, but on a slower clock. This is the system the early training injury story lives in. So how do tendons adapt? Two different things change when a tendon adapts. The first is how stiff it is, meaning how much it resists stretching when force is applied to it or deformation. A stiffer tendon transmits more of the muscle's force to the bone instead of absorbing it. The second is how big the tendon is, meaning the cross-sectional area if you cut it like a piece of rope. The stiffness changes first and size changes later. Both matter, but the lifter sort of feels the stiffness change before the size change, because stiffness is what determines how much of the person's muscle contraction, the muscular force, actually reaches the bar, the dumbbell, the machine, the whatever. The tendon adapts most when you load it heavy. Heavy contractions, let's call it 85 to 90% of the lifter's max, which tends to move relatively slowly each time you lift for several sets per session, several times a week for at least 12 weeks. That's the protocol that has been shown to drive the largest tendon changes. There's a meta-analysis from 2022, 61 studies, 763 participants, A caveat there. They only mostly recruited untrained individuals. There were only 3 studies that had well-trained individuals, and those 3 studies didn't actually see tendon stiffness change much, even with hard training. It's the same machinery, less remaining room, smaller short-term response, which is consistent with the through line of this episode. But the data set on well-trained individuals is pretty thin. The numbers that matter for programming, like what to use this for. Well, Kubo and colleagues ran a study where subjects trained their calves with hard, sustained contractions for several months while researchers tracked both the muscle and the Achilles tendon over time. It's in the back of your leg by your ankle. Muscle strength went up by month 2, but tendon stiffness didn't catch up until month 3. Even when the protocol was specifically designed to drive tendon adaptation, the tendon was still weeks behind the muscle. Think about this like the muscle's the engine in the car, and the tendon is the chassis that transmits the engine's power to the road. In early training, the engine builds faster, gains more horsepower than the chassis. The muscle can produce way more force before the tendon has finished reinforcing itself for it. Now, Austin, you see the consequences of the muscle outpacing tendon mismatch all the time. What's the pattern, and what does the conversation look like, and what's the framing you use with the presumably newer lifter who's sore in the wrong places?
Yeah, this comes up a lot in rehab-related conversations, whether relating to somebody who's experiencing, for example, a tendinopathy or a muscle tear, or somebody who is post-op from something. So in the context of muscle tears, which are fortunately uncommon, but do sometimes happen for a variety of reasons, whether in the gym or people who got a little too spicy with their, getting excited with high intensity, sprint training on flat ground and popped a hamstring or something like that. And as our friend and colleague, Dr. Miles has said, you will often feel better before you are better. In terms of the symptoms improving before the tissue is in a state where it's ready to be fully loaded and tolerate that for adaptive purposes. So there is a little bit of a lag time there that needs to be taken into consideration. When it comes to the tendons, they're even slower. And so a lot of times, the person's muscles and their joints and their bones might all feel quite good. But if they're dealing with a tendinopathy, depending on which tendon we're talking about, the quote unquote natural history for recovery of it can be on the order of 3 or 4 months for certain tendons, upwards of like a year or more for things like elbow tendinopathy, shoulder, rotator cuff syndrome, sometimes things like that can take even longer to recover. And that's, despite our best efforts in training and sometimes even independent of any training, the natural history might be for recovery, but just over a very long time span, something about the nature of those tissues. And you'll hear a lot of hypotheses around, blood flow and various other things that I don't think it's as worth getting into the weeds on, since it's not terribly modifiable in terms of leading to clinical outcomes of like, oh, now instead we can recover in 2 weeks instead of 2 months. And so those are some areas of big discrepancies. When it comes to post-operative situations, again, we have to respect those tissue healing timelines and load them commensurate with that. And then you've talked about this, I think, I forget which episode we had recently, where the question about adaptive capacity of muscle versus tendon in people who are like using anabolic steroids came up. And there's been, a lot of conversation around that of like, do they tend to stimulate more rapid adaptation in muscles than tendons can tolerate? And maybe is there an impact on injury risk? I think that whole space is still a bit hazy, at least to me. I think that it generally doesn't radically change how I would approach training for somebody in terms of like if they're tending to want to make massive jumps in their loading just because they're using, then that's generally ill-advised in most situations regardless. But I would recommend that to anybody, whether they're enhanced or not, I think.
Yeah, no, that to me, that's the logical end of this sort of question. Like when the muscles outpace the tendons or the other soft tissues, like what's the predicted response? And so from a macro standpoint, you look at the data on injury risk in people using androgenic anabolic steroids in exercise, and they tend to have higher injury rates. And you're like, okay, is this mostly some sort of psychologically mediated thing where they're like, look, I'm on, so I got to push it heavier, right? And so that kind of is the deciding factor, or is that more of the result of a sort of mismatch here between the muscles getting much, much stronger faster than the tendons? And the way I think about it always comes back to the racetrack for me, right? Now, at the track, you usually are split up based on the performance of not only your vehicle, but your driving skill, right? And so For example, I run the Time Trial Unlimited class, which means there's unlimited horsepower to weight ratio, and you tend to have more advanced drivers in this class compared to TT5, which is one of the entry level groups, lower horsepower to weight ratio, a good entry point. The point would be you take somebody from TT5 or somebody who's brand new, and you put them now in this race car, and you put them on track. The car is capable of a lot, right? Mm-hmm. That's the muscle. But the tendon maybe is the driver here, and they're not as capable, and they can get themselves into trouble, mainly because they're not used to, what can this car actually do? And so I think that's reasonable. There's been some hypotheses out there by various researchers that the anabolics themselves have some sort of impact on the tendon, a deleterious impact. That has not really been shown in humans, only in some Petri dish data and some rodent models. And I think the most likely explanation is that, the people just get stronger, which outpaces the sort of longer term scale of the tendon adapting. And because they're highly motivated, otherwise, why would they be using these agents? It becomes a more likely outcome that they suffer an injury, which to me makes sense, but need more data on that before I feel confident in stamping it. Does that make sense to you?
Fair. Yeah. I like the analogies.
So that's the connective tissue. It's the slowest of the fast adapting systems, sitting 6 to 8 weeks behind the muscle. And it takes the brunt of any loading schedule that was written for the muscle's clock. The engine builds faster than the chassis. The same machinery that was running in the new lifter and the 4-year lifter and the chassis on the experienced lifter has just had years to catch up to the engine. Now, one more system before we get to the consequence of all this, which is the injury data. The slowest one of all, the background process running underneath everything else, is bone. It's alive. Cue the Frankenstein music. Bone is a living tissue. It's constantly being broken down and rebuilt. And what determines whether it ends up denser or less dense is the load that you put on it, that you expose it to habitually. Heavy load placed in the right places in the right way makes the bone deposit more material there. An absence of loading is an absence of the signal needed to keep the bone around. The same biological process is running at year 1 and year 10, but the change that you can detect on a scan is small enough that no realistic training block produces a visible difference session to session, but the process is still doing work. As an example, the Lift More trial, we talked about this on our direct line for our Barbell Medicine Plus subscribers. This was done in 2018 by Watson and colleagues. 8 months of twice weekly heavy resistance training plus impact training. They were lifting 85% of their 1-rep max for 5 sets of 5. Now, I know listeners are like, dude, you can't do 5 sets of 5 with 85% of your 1-rep max. Well, if they were using a training max or if they were untrained, it's, squishy, but nevertheless, it's heavy. And then you're like, well, what was the impact training? Well, they were doing jumping pull-ups, and when they landed from the jumping pull-up, they had straight legs. And so what we think is that both of these things, the heavy resistance training and the landing on straight legs or just landing in general, that the stimulus on the bone is big enough to cause it to remodel. And this is sometimes called the osteogenic index. Now, these were women in their 60s and 70s. They were lifting heavy. The bone density on a scan rose by about 4% in the lumbar spine and about 2% at the hip joint compared to the control group. As far as why this matters, now look, the standard medical advice for women losing bone density is, look, you got to take calcium and you should exercise. But that exercise prescription tends to be just walk on a treadmill. Certainly it's not get under a heavy barbell and do some heavy lifting. And in fact, we had this post go viral about, osteoporosis and osteopenia protection. And what I said was, earlier on in life, women in their 20s and 30s, that is their sort of prime window for building bone mineral density. And that is the time where they should be training heavy. Now, look, if you miss that window, you should still be training heavy, lifting weights for bone mineral density in addition to other health adaptations. But that is your primary window. And it would be better if you started then. And that's the time you're being advertised to do Pilates and yoga and whatever, which are fine to do as long as you're also lifting weights. Now, people push back and they're like, are you saying that because I missed the window, I shouldn't even try? I'm like, well, no, that's not what I'm saying. It's just that it would have been better if you started earlier. It would have been better if you started early. And unfortunately, that advice is not making it into clinical practice. Austin, are you seeing any change in that? Like, your colleagues are a little different because they're more up on this stuff, but what do you think about the broader sort of landscape in primary care? Are women being told habitually to lift heavy weights in practice?
It's really hard for me. That's such a very general, sort of swath of clinical practice that for me to say confidently that trends are like meaningfully moving there, I don't know. I would like to think so. I think that, younger clinicians, I suspect, are more open to this. It's just that a lot of the older clinicians, or those who are unfamiliar with it, or those who have selection bias, meaning they tend to see people who maybe have had a bad experience, they're much less likely to counsel in that way. I talk a lot about how a lot of our patient selection bias informs a lot of the advice we give, and that's often actually a bad thing. So I'm not here to hate on orthopods, orthopedic surgeons, but they tend to see people who have musculoskeletal pain. And so I remember when pickleball was taking off, for example, in popularity, and of course, overuse syndromes happen when people who are underprepared for the task start jumping in and get excited and play. And then they go to the orthopedic surgeon because they have some shoulder pain or some knee pain. And then all these interviews in the media with orthopedists saying, it's this horrible, injurious activity and you shouldn't do it. And it's no, you're not seeing all the people who aren't going to the hospital for their heart attack or their diabetic amputation because they've gotten more active, and weighing those things out is hard to do. It's hard for, you, if you're in a particular silo or niche, to recognize that broader thing. And it's also just hard in general to see things that don't happen compared with things that do, right? So if people are training and reducing the risk of osteoporosis and not having fractures, that's not something that I see in my day-to-day practice, for example, in the hospital, whereas the person who does have the osteoporotic fracture, I would. And say they came in and they had a fracture and they did train, maybe I'm oh no, it happened because of your training, right? So it's easy to draw those wrong conclusions instead of relying on much broader bases of data. And that's why disseminating this type of data, these messages, can hopefully nudge practice in a more positive direction. So I would definitely like to think that trends are encouraging there. That still is going to have a little bit of a drop off in terms of okay, so we have more people recommending it. What does that mean for uptake? And and then once people uptake it, what does that mean for long-term uptake and consistency? And then what does that mean for outcomes? So there's I view it as a waterfall type effect of you need more people counseling to lead to more people uptaking, to lead to more people staying consistent, to ultimately impact the things that we care about in terms of outcomes. And that's just really hard for people to, observe or determine based on vibes or their day-to-day practice compared with much larger data sets.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, we know that doctors, generally speaking, in primary care are not counseling folks on exercise. That's relatively rare, maybe 1 in 10.
Yeah.
I suspect that very few of those recommendations involve the specific prescription to lift heavy weights, right? And to the extent that lands, I suspect that the uptake also may be a little less on average there, because there's this sort of popular narrative that lifting heavy is more dangerous. And so at all those steps, there are problems. And yeah, I suspect it's just relatively low. All right, well, that covers the 4 systems: neural, muscle, tendon, bone. Same machinery in the trained and untrained lifter. I think we can reject that part of the claim for the NIA framework. It's just the room that's left to adapt is what's different. Now, the consequence of getting that wrong, which pops up when we talk about injuries. The NIA framework's progression model says that novices should add weight every session because their biology supports it. The injury data, though, tells us a different story, and the mechanism is the connective tissue lag that we just talked about. Okay, let's zoom out for a second just to make sure that we're not noceboing anybody. Resistance training, lifting weights, has one of the lowest injury rates of any physical activity. It's about 2 to 4 injuries per 1,000 participation hours across bodybuilding, powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, CrossFit, etc. And most gym injuries aren't actual catastrophes. They're overuse presentations. So it's not an acute, I ruptured a pec, I broke a bone, whatever, snapped a tendon. It's more I've got some tendinopathy. For example, muscle strains, nagging aches that develop over 2 to 3 weeks because the training load climbed faster than the tissue could adapt. Also, the average symptom duration for resistance training injuries is less than 2 weeks on average. Most people can come back from this relatively quickly, which speaks against disc herniations, torn ligaments, etc. Lifting is, in absolute terms, relatively safe, but compared to running, it's even safer. Recreational running has an injury risk of about 10 or more injuries per 1,000 participation hours. So if anyone in your life is using injury risk as a reason for you to not lift or for them to not lift, well, that's not really evidence-based. So let's compare newer trainees to older trainees and see if there's a sort of gap there in the injury prevalence data. And one of the best comparisons actually comes from CrossFit data. This is from Prado and Gonzalez in 2020. These people are doing roughly the same movements with the same equipment in the same environment, same general programming approach. Novice CrossFitters in the first 8 weeks had an average injury rate of 9.5 injuries per 1,000 training hours. Experienced CrossFit participants doing roughly the same training had 0.74 to 3.3 injuries per 1,000 participation hours. We see the same signal in Olympic weightlifting, where more advanced lifters actually have less injuries than newer lifters. A factor of 3 to 10 in the same sport, though, in this CrossFit data set. The movements didn't really change. It's just the person's preparation for those movements and their experience did. Now, yeah, that's observational. It's not randomized. The people who stuck with CrossFit long enough to be experienced trainees are the same people whose bodies sort of tolerated it, a little survivorship bias there. The gap is real, and the mechanism we're about to walk through is consistent with it, but part of the gap, again, is a survivorship bias. Tissue capacity, as we've talked about before in this podcast, kind of behaves like a checking account balance. A training session is a withdrawal. If you've got $1,000 in your account, an attempted withdrawal of $1,200 produces a sort of overdraft fee. That's the injury. It could be pain, soreness that doesn't resolve, or even a structural problem. The balance isn't fixed. It grows with consistent training. And any withdrawal that exceeds the current balance produces a problem regardless of how the withdrawal was made. A novice might have $1,000 in their account, but the experienced trainee has $10,000. The same training session might overdraw the novice and barely even show up for the experienced trainee. The mechanism is similar to what we talked about with anabolic steroids. But what this means for early training injuries, a loading schedule that prescribes session-to-session weight additions because the trainee is, quote, still in the novice phase, is imposing a muscle pace schedule on top of a connective tissue pace problem. So Austin, walk us through the consult. The new lifter, they're 4 months into their resistance training. They've got some knee pain. They come in convinced that the program failed them. What does that conversation actually look like?
Yeah, after an assessment of their symptoms, if I am also convinced that this is likely a case of patellar tendinopathy, I'm trying to get a sense of a few things. Really, what is the nature of the stimulus that they were trying to apply? And then what is their kind of recovery tolerance situation look like? So the first would be, what's their prior injury history look like? Because a lot of times the main risk factor for having an injury is like having a prior history of that same injury. And then as far as characterizing the stimulus and getting a sense of what does their training look like, the main things that I want to know is, what is the frequency of loading? What is the volume of loading compared with what they were used to beforehand? What is the intensity of that loading? And then what is the nature of it in terms of specificity versus like variety, right? Because those are several of the levers that I'm going to manipulate to help dig them out of this hole from a rehab standpoint. So most of the time when I see this, it's somebody who is using either inappropriately high intensity, inappropriately high training volume for their prior level of fitness when they started out on this, and they are often using too much specificity, meaning the exercises that they're doing are too similar over time, which is another kind of hallmark of developing overuse syndromes. Instead of having more moderate training volume, more variable intensity, some high, some medium, some low, and then having a broader base of exercise variation, at least while you're trying to prepare yourself for a phase of higher specificity. So this is why, for example, in our own training, we tend to maintain, I would say, moderate to, in certain periods of time, high training volume. We have a moderate amount of training specificity that when it increases, for example, it's only for a relatively brief period of time leading into a competition, and then it backs off again kind of after that. So we are not doing, for example, exclusively squat, bench press, deadlift, 3 times a week year round or something like that. There's a lot more variation. Even within those main movements, they are varied in other ways. There's unilateral work. There's, movement in other odd ways that are not characteristic for, competitive powerlifting, for example, doing other sorts of quote unquote athletic type movements and activities, doing conditioning, things like that to build a robust base of physical capacity to tolerate a lot of things that we can then choose to apply more specifically kind of at any point along the way. So that's kind of the nature of the conversation, is like, what is your prior base of fitness? What are you trying to do? Right. And then how can I manipulate those levers to kind of dig you back out of that hole?
Yeah, I just think when you have this sort of rigid progression model that is kind of put forth by, again, a very literal interpretation of this NIA framework that's telling you got to add weight here. Got to do it. Can't stop it.
Yeah.
And we know that the muscle-related adaptations outpace the connective tissue ones. To me, this is a predictable response. And so the question then is, well, are there unique advantages for that pacing? And I think some people feel like, well, look, it's prescriptive. I know exactly what to do. Every time I go in the gym, I don't have to think about it, right? That's one thing. And I see that because, again, people, maybe they want to turn their brain off and just go exercise. They don't want to, dig into the programming weeds too much. They don't want to engage in this nerdery. I get that. The other person is like convinced this works better. And so like the first one, I don't have a problem with because I can work around that. The second one is, I don't know, more, it's harder to deal with because you have to convince somebody that, look, just adding the weight, particularly before the adaptations that we need have shown up, have come online, that is actually working worse for you. Mm-hmm. It's not making you stronger. You're just moving the goalposts because the thing got harder. And oh, by the way, you're setting yourself up for this potential injury risk that doesn't need to be there because, again, it's not working better for you from the adaptations that you're chasing. And I suspect in your experience, that's also been harder to deal with.
Yeah, exactly. I have little to add. I think that's reflective of our experience collectively.
Here's something I realized about myself. I eat well when the setup is there. When there's something healthy and ready to go in my fridge, I'll eat it. When there's not, I end up staring at a cast iron skillet at about 8 p.m. and just, I'm not doing that. Well, Factor solved that for me. These are fully prepared meals designed by dietitians and crafted by chefs delivered right to your door. I've been using the Muscle Pro collection because the macros tend to line up with my energy targets, but they have meals built around whatever your goals are. Weight loss, overall nutrition, more protein, GLP-1 support. With Factor, I'm hitting my nutrition goals even when I run out of time for planning, grocery runs, or cooking. And in the middle of this home reno, I need it. And these are high-quality meals. Lean proteins, colorful vegetables, whole foods, healthy fats, and they're fresh, never frozen. And they're even ready in about 2 minutes. With all the different options, you could use Factor to hit your nutrition goals. Head over to factormeals.com/BBM50off and use code BBM50off to get 50% off and a free daily greens box if that's something you're interested in. New subscribers only, while supplies last. See the website for more details. That's factormeals.com/BBM50off. If you work in healthcare, you probably already know this, but just in case, it's Nurses Week. Time to shout out the people who keep everything running and who also happen to be some of the best humans that I know. To celebrate, Figs just dropped new limited edition colors and styles, and everything is 20% off for Nurses Week. Scrubs, outerwear, footwear, all of it. If you've been listening to us for a while, you know why we like Figs. They're actually designed their stuff for people who work in healthcare. Comfortable, lightweight, durable, antimicrobial, and they fit like real clothes instead of those boxy hospital issue fabrics. They get what the job demands. So if you're in healthcare, do not miss out. 20% off for Nurses Week, happening May 6th through May 12th. Go to wearfigs.com. That's 20% off during Nurses Week at wearfigs.com. Lately, I've been trying to upgrade my style, basically what I wear day to day. Fewer pieces, but ones that actually feel good and look put together without overthinking it. Quince has been my go-to for that. The fabrics feel elevated, the fits are clean, and everything just works. Right now, they have all the spring staples dialed in. 100% European linen shorts and shirts starting at just $34. Lightweight, breathable, comfortable, and they still look polished. They also have these clean 100% Pima cotton tees with the softness that just has to be felt. Their pants hit with the same balance, and they actually fit me right off the rack. They're relaxed and comfortable, but still put together enough to wear pretty much anywhere. Everything is priced 50 to 80% less than what you would find from similar brands. Quince works directly with ethical factories, so you're getting the premium materials without the markup. I recently picked up a few of their cotton silk sweater polos, and they've been heavy in my rotation for when I'm leaving the house. Feels lightweight and soft, but looks sharp. $62 for something that feels like it should cost twice that? Yeah, that's the Quince thing in a nutshell. Refresh your everyday with luxury you'll actually use. Head to quince.com/BBM for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/BBM for free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/BBM. If you've been dealing with a nagging injury, if you just came out of surgery, or you work with people who have, I want to tell you about our upcoming pain and rehab seminar in Bozeman, Montana, June 20th and 21st. This is a 2-day deep dive into how we actually think about pain, rehab, and getting people back to exercise. We've updated the curriculum this year to reflect where the evidence is right now, with training lectures covering the current recommendations for exercise during injury and rehab, and breakout sessions on exercise modifications and technique tailored to specific individuals. This isn't just a powerlifting-focused event. The modifications content has been expanded to cover athletes across different sports, so wherever you're meeting your current patients or clients, there's going to be something you can put directly into practice. For example, the lower extremity post-op lecture and its subsequent breakout walks through the full rehab spectrum after surgery, with a strong emphasis on the middle phase of training. This is the phase that gets the least attention and causes the most problems. We spend real time on the return to sport criteria and how to structure progressions that actually get somebody there. The pain lecture also has new cases this year and is built around helping folks make sense of what they're experiencing. Not just here's what the research says, but how to use that information in a real conversation with a real person who's frustrated and confused and wants to know what to do next. Spots are limited, so if you want to learn more and register today, head over to barbellmedicine.com and look for the Bozeman Pain and Rehab Seminar. We also have a link in the show notes below. All right, welcome back to the Barbell Medicine Podcast. Now, before we get into what to actually do with all of this, there's one more piece of the framework that needs to get out of the way, and that's fatigue. Ask any coach why advanced lifters need different programming, and the answer is almost always something about fatigue management. The problem with that answer is that fatigue is at least 4 different things, and the framework is treating them as one thing. So the 4 different things that people are calling fatigue. This is a taxonomy that comes from Anoka and Duchateau in 2016, and a 2023 study by Barron's updated the terminology. So 4 different buckets here, if you will. First one is performance fatigability. This is what you can measure on the bar speed, the weight on it, how much the bar speed drops during a set, the force output declining during a sustained contraction. You can measure all of this. You can also think about this as the engine in your car, the hardware. How much power can you produce? All right. The second bucket here is perceived fatigability. It's what the set feels like. 2 lifters could do the same workout. One feels destroyed while the other one feels fine. That's a different thing from what the bar is doing. This is really the driver of the car. You think about, again, you're on track. The car and its motor and transmission and gearing has, a particular top speed, but the driver, what they're experiencing, I hear the rumble of the engine. I hear the chassis making noise. I don't want to push it, right? That is the signal that the driver is getting and responding to, okay? So that's the second bucket. The third is called trait or state fatigue. This is what the lifter or individual walks into the gym carrying, the I feel beat up this week, and that exists independent of any specific set, sort of background tiredness, if you will. And the fourth is recovery state. This is really the inverse of the first 3. The first 3 describe fatigue from different angles, whether it's at the structural level, whether it's from the individual level, right, and what they're responding to. This last one is mainly like, are the tissues able to adapt right now? Okay, whether the body is currently positioned to turn a training stimulus into an adaptation, and whether the same session will deepen the sort of deficit, put them into a hole. Why this matters. These 4 different things do not always move together. A lifter can sleep poorly. They're anxious about a 1-rep max attempt. They are a little hungover, whatever. The perceived fatigability is high. But the actual lift, a 1-rep max, only takes a few seconds. So the perceived fatigue doesn't have to limit what the bar does. People have PR'd under these situations. You just got to get it together for a few seconds, right? The lifter feels heavy. The lifter can, perform a 1-rep max and do it well. Conversely, if a lifter's overreached, right, they've been doing a really high training load sort of program, the muscles, contractile machinery, or the engine in the car is subtly impaired, right? They want to lift more, they want to lift faster, they want to do more, whatever, but they can't because there's something at the structural level that's problematic. They feel fine, but they lift poorly overall. Both patterns are predicted by this framework, and they look like contradictions only if you treat fatigue as one thing, but it's not. Now, the framework typically claims that experienced lifters can tolerate more, recover faster, or experience fatigue qualitatively differently compared to novices or untrained lifters, as if those are biological facts. But the data doesn't really support that either. What experienced lifters have is a calibrated reference distribution for effort. They know what hard feels like because they've been there enough times. There's actually some really interesting neurophysiology here about your brain basically sends a carbon copy of what they perceive the effort to be downstream, and your body sort of calibrates that. It's pretty interesting, and it's more refined in advanced lifters. So RPE, how it actually works. RPE in resistance training is typically anchored to repetitions in reserve, meaning how many more reps the lifter could have done. This is particularly true of multi-rep sets, so like a set of 5, 6, 7, something like that. Whereas doing a 1-rep sort of effort, single at RPE 8, we usually anchor that to other things rather than just how many more reps can you do. You can use that, but we use a different proxy. The problem is that reps in reserve depends on knowing what failure feels like. And that knowledge is built by kind of going to failure before, paying attention and calibrating that against an actual outcome. So 2 lifters who both report RPE 9 on a set of 8 may have very different actual proximities to failure. For a trained individual, RPE-9 might be reasonably close to a true 1 repetition in reserve set. But for an untrained individual on a 3 rep max, RPE-9 might be 3 to 5 reps from failure if the novice has never genuinely failed. There's been some head-to-head literature here, which I think is interesting. Halperin in 2022 did a scoping review. Lifters of all experience levels under-predict reps to failure by 2 to 5 reps on average, with only a tendency toward improved accuracy in more experienced trainees. But a 2025 head-to-head study on the back squat in a Smith machine found no statistically significant difference in repetitions in reserve accuracy between trained and untrained groups. How to square this? I think you can say that the training status effect on repetition in reserve accuracy, RPE accuracy, is relatively small and inconsistent. I don't really care about the 2 to 5 reps on average difference, to be clear, particularly in a new individual, especially because I know it's going to get better over time. This is a skill with exposure deliberately to things that are closer to failure, maybe even true failure on average. People are going to get better. And so I'm kind of fine with that. Now, Austin, what do you think about the argument for not using RPE in beginners because they're, quote, too inexperienced to rate it accurately?
Yeah. I feel like, I don't know, this is a conversation that's been batted back and forth for many years now. It's not something that raises a great deal of concern for us, I think, especially when we take a very long-term perspective on people's training career. I think about this all the time when we get questions from people who say, for example, like, I went on vacation and I had to shift my training schedule by, a week. What should I do when I get back? And my first thought is like, let's assume that you're going to continue training over the long term. 5 years from now, is this decision going to have a meaningful impact on where you end up at that time point, right? And this is contrasted with like lots of other examples in other areas where such decisions may in fact have big enough impact, right? So, if you end up choosing to do a deload every other week, in perpetuity, like, yeah, you're going to probably end up in a different spot because you're training like half the time that you would otherwise. Or if you choose to control your lipids earlier in life compared with not, that is going to lead to more likely different outcomes like a decade from now. This type of a thing, whether or not you choose to use RPE, whether just purely as a descriptive thing or whether you choose to develop that skill early on in your training or not, again, at the 5-year time point in your training, at the 10-year time point in your training, not something where I'm terribly concerned about whether you are like not quite accurate enough to within 2 reps versus 3 or 4 reps early on in your first, 3 months of training or 6 months of training or something like that. In other words, like the magnitude of impact over the long kind of time frame of training, the outcomes that we really care about are not likely to be meaningfully impacted. And so given that it is a skill, given that this sort of, we'll call it an interoception, which is a fancy way of having this like internal sense of your like physiologic state and your proximity to failure, how hard you're trying, how much more room you have to go. That's something that everybody needs to figure out one way or another. It is foolish, and you will not find successful long-term lifters who ignore that internal sense and just say, well, the paper says I have to lift this weight, so this weight is going to get lifted. And then they like fail reps all the time because they ignored those sorts of signals. So learning what those signals feel like and recognizing them, correlating them with your actual performance, if you can do that collaboratively with a coach, even better. But the idea that you're too inexperienced to even try to start like paying attention to these things early on, it's just kicking a can down the road that doesn't need to be kicked down the road for like no meaningful benefit. And in fact, just delaying the inevitable in that sense.
Yeah. Again, I think this goes back to this very rigidly held NIA framework that, the weight on the bar, the load that you're lifting is so critical that if you miss it, even slightly, you're cooked. Your results, 0. And that is definitively not the case. Even if we accepted this idea that people who are new to training, if they used RPE and reps in reserve only to select the load, that they're going to be way off, right? 2 to 5 reps in reserve off each single time. Oh my gosh, go crazy. I still don't care. They're close enough, especially for health purposes. Might they get a slightly reduced increase in strength for 3 months? Maybe. Sure. I'll say that. 6 months? Sure. I'll even be charitable. 6 months. I don't care.
Yeah.
What I care about in the first 6 months of training, did somebody get bit by the fitness bug and now it's part of their lifestyle, right? Are they enjoying it? Do they stay injury-free? And are they setting themselves up for long-term success? Which means not hyper-specializing in a handful of lifts. It means building a cardiorespiratory fitness base. It means exposing themselves, sampling different exercises and different setups so they kind of get a sense of, I do like this, I don't like this, release right now. And then ultimately being well suited for the rest of their training career, which hopefully lasts for decades and decades and decades. What happens in the first 6 months in any sport is almost irrelevant outside of like, did the person like it? Did they show some like predilection towards this, which requires some sampling, right? And did they not get hurt? And so they kind of burned out too soon. I mean, you said that before, but I feel like it just bared some repeating here.
Yeah, agree.
All right. Well, to me, the clearest training status difference in acute recovery in newer lifters compared to more experienced lifters is the repeated bout effect. First time that you do a new exercise, you get sore for days afterwards. But the second time, a little less. The third time, less still. We think that roughly after 2 to 6 weeks of consistent training, an untrained lifter's recovery from a given session starts to look like what a trained lifter is able to recover from. The novice recovery in any meaningful biological sense lasts about 6 weeks. It's kind of like they're under recovering, basically because the stuff is so new to them. After that, it's the same recovery physiology that runs in the trained lifter as running in the new lifter, attenuated only by the absolute loads that they're handling and the lifter's calibration of what hard means. So that's also changing. All of this is to say, it's not unusual for a newer trainee to appear to have worse recovery when they're exposed to maybe a lower training load. It's because everything's novel to them, right? But as they are exposed repeatedly, this becomes less. And so these things start to converge. Ultimately, I think this is just a short period of time. And again, what happens in the first few months is irrelevant unless you get injured because of a aggressive progression strategy that is kind of the through line of the novice, intermediate, advanced framework.
Yeah, I would just add one thing here, that this is not purely a matter of how well trained somebody is in general, but you could take a very highly trained, even elite powerlifter, like, hey, let's take yourself. And you've been training very high specificity for a while, maybe preparing for a meet, and then have you pivot and you do a training week where your lower body training is all like barbell reverse lunges, and your upper body, you include some trunk work and you do a bunch of GHD sit-ups. You are going to be very, very sore from both of those things because they are very foreign to you, big time eccentric component to those movements. You're going to have quite a lot of soreness that's going to feel a lot like, oh, am I a novice or am I a beginner? Am I untrained? It's like, yeah, on those movements you are, right? So that's kind of supporting the point that these things are operating all the time or not operating. It's not just a generalized change in, people's capacity, but rather there is some degree of specificity to that repeated bout effect.
Yeah, and most of that, should be stated, is in the periphery. The sort of experience of the soreness with these novel exercises is mostly in the periphery. And what I mean by that is at the level of the muscle, right? You're getting more muscular damage. And so it's like your engine, again, instead of normally producing 500 horsepower, well, now it's only able to do 400 horsepower just because the muscle, or in this case, the motor itself, has some structural damage. But people talk about this other sort of type of fatigue, not at the periphery, but at the level of the brain, this sort of CNS fatigue. My CNS is fried. That sort of claim that advanced lifters are limited by accumulated central nervous system fatigue, CNS fatigue, and therefore require categorically different programming approaches. This has been tested directly by Scarabot and colleagues in 2018. They designed a study to find out where the fatigue from a hard training session actually lies. So here's a setup. Trained men, they did 10 sets of 5 back squats at 80% of their 1 rep max. That's a lot. A session that most people, including your 2 hosts here, would call hard. The researchers used 2 tools to localize the fatigue. The first tool stimulates the nerve in the leg directly with electricity to test the muscle's response, bypassing the brain. The second uses a magnetic pulse over the head to test whether the motor cortex in the brain, this is the part of the brain that drives voluntary movement, is putting out the signal it normally puts out. It sounds like some sci-fi stuff, but this is used in the research, TMS. Comparing those 2 before and after the session tells you whether the fatigue is in the muscle or in the brain. What they found was that the session produced fatigue that took up to 72 hours to fully resolve. Real fatigue, that's not really in dispute. The muscle is what showed the fatigue. The brain did not. The motor cortex was firing the same way after the session as before. The fatigue was peripheral, meaning in the muscle and the connective tissue, not central. Of course, this was a single session, so short term. These are in trained men, small sample size. But the study did show that a single hard squat session doesn't produce measurable sort of brain fatigue in the window where lifters claim to be fried. It doesn't rule out a chronic CNS adaptation building up over months. That's a different question, and the data on that is pretty much absent at this time. The within session detail that kind of goes against another popular claim. Lower load sets taken to failure produce more discomfort, more perceived fatigue, and more heart rate variability suppression, and more acute force loss than heavy, low rep work performed further away from failure. So it's like doing 12 rep max compared to 3 reps at RP 7 or 8. So for many trained lifters, doing the sets of 3 is less acutely fatiguing than doing 3 sets of 12 to failure. So the next time that somebody tells you they need to drop the heavy work because their CNS is fried, the data says the high rep set you just watch them grind through actually hit them harder. Austin, the CNS fatigue framing has some real traction in the lifting community. How do you handle somebody that you're talking to who's convinced they need an extended deload because their CNS is fried?
I would definitely want to know what they mean by that. Like, what are they actually experiencing? And what are all the potential variables that could be impacting that? Like, how is their sleep and nutrition? And again, what are they trying to do in the gym compared with their, level of fitness? Is there a more wholesale overhaul of the program that might be appropriate? Like, are they routinely training and, their average training session, is, 10 singles at near a 1 rep max level effort? Or is it sets of, 5? I've had some, I'm like thinking of a consult calls that I've done with folks and some of them who have sent me training programs where in a given session, they're doing anywhere from sometimes 8 upwards of 10 or more exercises. And each exercise itself, they're doing 4 to 6 sets. And I'm like, that is a massive amount of work to be doing per session and to be training, say, 4 to 6 times a week. And so I'm just like, I just have to pull the reins on you for a bit. And then we need to kind of hone in on like, what are you actually trying to accomplish here and align the program more with your goals? Because a lot of times people who are training in that fashion don't really have very particular goals, because if you did, it wouldn't take you very long to notice that the program you're doing is not getting you closer to those goals. If it is so widely distributed in terms of the variety of exercises, the super high volume, the high recovery requirements, things like that. So really it's just characterizing like, what is the person experiencing? What can I modify? And then what is the goal that we're trying to work towards? And just trying to bring those things into a little bit better alignment. It's very unlikely that they need an extended deload. Very few people in strength training in particular need extended deloads. I would say there are some folks, maybe in the ultra endurance realm, we've talked about this recently, issues with like low energy availability to the extent that, somebody believes REDS is a thing. There's been some recent controversy around that, although I think it's a justifiable thing to be concerned about in a lot of folks. Those might need a little bit of a longer kind of back off period and health, focusing on health instead of their training. But in strength training, it's very unlikely that somebody needs like months long deload or something like that. They might need to back off for a week or 2 or something like that. But even then, there's probably a better formulation of training that can be set up that they would tolerate much better and is likely to be better aligned with their goals. If they think they need that much work for hypertrophy, they probably don't. If they think they need that much work for strength, they almost certainly don't. And so then it's a matter of like aligning those things.
Yeah. And ultimately, this doesn't really matter. Even if you do accept the NIA framework, if you're a novice, intermediate, or advanced, it's all the same, which kind of begs the question, why do we have the framework in the first place? So one more thing worth talking about, because the NIA framework leans on it heavily for justifying volume and training load escalation across categories, MRV, maximum recoverable volume. The idea is that each lifter has a specific number of working sets per week per muscle group that they can recover from, and that program should be built around that number. To me, MRV may be useful as coaching shorthand. It's never been validated as a number that you can use or you can measure for an individual lifter. It's more this abstract concept. but it's sensitive to sleep, nutrition, life stress, exercise selection, the cumulative load history of the past several weeks, whatever the lifter's MRV is this month, it's probably going to be different the next month. So like, what's the point? It's not stable enough to anchor any sort of prescription. Now, advanced lifters, experienced lifters do tend to tolerate more absolute volume and training load, but the relationship isn't linear, and it's confounded by the fact that advanced lifters, experienced lifters also need more relative stimulus to adapt. Their floor and their ceiling, if you will, rise together. Useful as language maybe for autoregulation, maybe useful for coaching shorthand, but I don't really think this is like a way to separate people into novices, intermediate, or advanced. And I also don't think it's like worth trying to identify, again, because like it's going to change either next week, next month, or whatever. And also I think it's a little limited. Max recoverable volume, I could get behind maybe max recoverable training load, but again, how would you identify it? That's just one factor in training load. I think training load is more important than just volume. So that clears out the main fatigue claims that the NIA framework leans on. Now, what to actually do with all of this? The replacement for the NIA framework isn't a different set of categories. It's really more of a different orientation towards exercise prescription and programming. And we want it to be reactive, driven by what the individual actually demonstrates, rather than proactive, driven by what a category implies should be happening. And the rest of this is what that looks like at each phase in a training career. So we've talked about this a number of times on the podcast. One of the things we like to do as far as generating reactive approach within a given training session is using the warm-up for what it's telling you. To me, this is one of the most reliable within session signals, a weight that you've performed regularly enough that its feel is sort of well calibrated at your current training level. So for example, my last warm-up on a squat when I'm working with relatively heavy weights is usually 455, right? If it's for singles, it's going to be heavier than that, usually 550, but for multi-rep sets, it's usually 455. If the set moves noticeably faster than I expect, it requires less effort than usual, feels light in a way that kind of makes sense to me, I think my performance potential that day is a little higher. So I can add a little bit of weight. On the other hand, if it feels slower, harder, or off in a way that also feels meaningful, to me, I'm like, well, my performance potential today is not quite what I would hope it would be. So adding weight would be a bad idea. I probably need to actually take weight off the bar. And then if it feels about the same, maybe I even need to repeat a set. I think that when things feel lighter, to me, what I'm interpreting that is strength has either declared itself or that this is just noise, right? I'm picking up noise, but I also, again, I expect my performance to vary day to day. That's human performance in a nutshell. If it feels heavier, I think that doesn't mean I think my strength is going down. It just means, again, I'm within that sort of performance variability. But the logic is the same at year 1 as it is at year 10. The only thing that changes is the size of the increments, the weight on the bar, and the frequency at which maybe these things show up. Does that make sense to you, Austin?
Yeah, I think that reflects my experience as well. I think that, our like near maximum efforts have been, essentially near maximum at each stage of our training career. And there were indicators, there were signs on the way up towards that effort. But you're right that, I can remember, anybody who's been at this long enough, let's say that you are in a place where you've used like pound plates, for example, in the gym, the first time that you decide that you're going to like skip 95 pounds or skip 185 pounds, and suddenly your increment goes from 135 to 225, that feels like a big deal. Those like quarter plate jumps and you're like, I can skip that and jump from, 225 to 315, or, they become a bigger and bigger deal. The bigger of jumps. I know that you and I historically, like you have made some gargantuan jumps before, or at least what felt like it at the time. And that's really the thing that's changing. But fundamentally, the underlying biology and all that is the same over that period of time, I think.
Yeah, agreed. All right, next part is what counts as a genuine stall? Because to me, it's worth investigating. If somebody's really stalled, we call it maybe a lack of demonstrable improvement in a priority lift over 3 to 4 weeks with consistent training, adequate sleep, adequate nutrition, and manageable life stress all in place. Well, the window for this detection scales in both directions. If somebody with less training history, it's generally a shorter window. More training history is a longer window. But how do you measure it? You have to measure it against a recent anchor. right? The best performance maybe in the past 6 to 8 weeks, not a lifetime best. Like my lifetime best deadlift right now is 748 pounds, right? And if I looked at my training right now, I'd be like, oh my God, my deadlift is terrible. It's like, well, actually it's going up over the past, 16 weeks or so. It's a good sign, but I'm still not back at my peak level performance because I'm not really prioritizing it. So you have to use a recent anchor. That's thing one. Two, you have to compare like to like, whether it's an estimated 1 rep max from sets performed with the same rep range, same RPE target, that can be useful. Whether it's a rep max set, whether it's a single rep, something. You just can't compare like, well, I did 10 reps at RP7, what I rated RP7, and this is my estimated 1 rep max, and this is a single rep at RP8. And I'm just comparing them. Oh, look, I got weaker. Like, those are really two different tasks here. So one way to also do this is at the beginning and end of each block. So usually the way I program and a lot of our templates program is that the first week of a new training program, if you were to switch programs, is an introduction week. And so new movements, and I usually have people do ascending sets. So let's say the first exercise is the back squat. 4 reps at RP6, 4 reps at RP7, 4 reps at RP8. That's all you do. It's sort of a calibration thing. How strong are you? What's the ballpark that you're in, right? Kind of sets your sort of expectations as far as your current performance level. Well, 8 weeks later, the end of the block, let's say it went 8 weeks long, I'm going to have you do 4 reps at 6, 4 reps at 7, 4 reps at 8. You get to sort of compare at the beginning and the end. Did we see demonstrable improvements? Basically a test with relatively low stakes here. So that's one way that I approach some of our programming here. Now, Austin, I want you to walk us through this consult to wrap this up. A trainee shows up, squat hasn't moved in 4 weeks. Sleep's been bad, work's been bad. He wants to know if the program is broken or if he needs more volume. What do you do?
Take a detailed history and get a sense of what are the sources of biggest concern for the person, and basically trying to identify the targets that I can realistically intervene on. So much of this, as with many of these sort of scenarios, and these are pretty common consults that I'll do through, people will contact us at Barbell Medicine for consults. They'll do them with me. I know they've done some with you, some of our other coaches as well, to provide some guidance in this area. And really getting a sense of what are their goals and priorities, what are their expectations, and what sort of modifications are they willing to make. So I know that I'm starting out kind of speaking in generalities, and that's mainly because I've seen so many of these consults with so many different actual management strategies that have ended up being appropriate for the person. Sometimes they do need a bit of a deload. Sometimes they do ultimately need a little bit more training volume, but only once we're able to get some of these other, variables like life variables kind of in line. And sometimes they actually have a medical issue that has arisen and that they were not tracking. Like maybe you actually need to get some like labs done or some form of testing. Maybe something else is going on. And this is kind of the initial declaration of, something pathologic that's happening. Not the most common outcome, but certainly something that I'm like very attuned to in the way that I think about things when I'm listening to somebody. So really aligning their expectations with the way we're setting up their training program in the short term. And then looking for like what I would call red flags being things that need more radical changes in management, more of a substantial pullback in training, more of a substantial change in their nutrition or medical evaluation. So it's really difficult to pin down like a very specific strategy here because these things can look so different. But what is that? How does that sound to you compared with your experience, or like where do you see these consults typically going in practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately the way you've kind of worked through this systematically is first identifying like, okay, look, this is your experience. You validate it, right? You build a rapport. And then you're kind of looking for modifiable levers, whether it's a reversible medical cause, right? Or something that's declared itself, like you mentioned. Or in this case, the environment is not ripe for gains, right? You haven't slept, work's bad, stress is high, whatever. And you're like, okay, well, are any of these things modifiable right now? Right, because ultimately, what you are perceiving here, or what you're interpreting, is that the training load may or may not be appropriate. I just don't know because it is being wrecked by the environment in which that training load is being applied. And so, if we cannot change the environment, then the training load has to change. It's probably not going to be more volume, though.
Yeah, agree.
Not until which I think is the simple answer. But yeah, ultimately, after you establish the relationship, look for other causes that are unrelated to either training load or environment. Then you can address the training load, and whether it should go up or down is more of a function of like what happens when the stuff is resolved, right? And if it can't resolve, then it's like, well, you only have really one choice, and that's going to be to decrease it temporarily.
Yeah, agree. Temporary pullback and then kind of recalibrating the program beyond that for the person's tolerance and what they're able to do. Sometimes I make an argument for like an even bigger pivot, and I'm like, have you considered just like taking a few weeks and the horror of like, what if we just like didn't touch a barbell for a little bit of time and found some other activities that you might not have so much like prior psychological anchoring to? Something totally different, something that you might actually just like enjoy, maybe something that's like outside, I don't know, and finding some other things to play with. Because again, my argument is, do you think that, let's say we did this for 2 weeks or 4 weeks, then fast forward 5 years, are you going to be at a certain point 5 years from now and be like, if only I hadn't done that 2-week pivot 5 years ago, right? And so finding ways to dig people out of this hole in the short term so that we can recalibrate. You could do a lot of things in the near term and still end up in a really good place over the long term. So, almost anything is an option.
Yeah. Yeah. I think how this ties into this sort of NIA framework, novice, intermediate, advanced, is that when people are talking about a stall, we have to also make sure that it's not a problem with the sort of detection window or observation window, right? The reason why that framework, I think, resonates with so many people is because that's their lived experience. They got much stronger when they first started compared to later on in their training career. And they're like, well, look, something fundamentally different was happening there. And what I think is they're experiencing is just that the detection window for these adaptations was much, much shorter. And so it showed up more regularly, right? And that's what and the signal to noise ratio was also smaller. But as you get more and more trained, the detection window, the observation window has to be longer. Your signal to noise ratio is also higher, right? Your 5 to 10% swing in strength performance day to day is now much larger in absolute terms. And so there's a lot more noise there. But I think overall, we can reject each one of the novice, intermediate, and advanced claims. One, the first claim was that, look, there's different rates at which these underlying adaptive processes are functioning. I do not think that's true. I don't think the muscle protein synthesis rates are really changing that much. The connective tissue synthesis rates, all of these sort of things are still running at the same rate. There's just bigger difference between where you're at currently and your sort of ceiling. Two, I do not think that these rates are different. And so therefore, I do not think that they require different progression models. I think that progression should be reactive to what the person is actually doing. You can address that within a session using the warm-up sets, for example, also retrospectively after the end of a training block to see how the progression actually went, but it should still be reactive. What is the person doing? What's their performance potential? Let's match the load, the weight selection, everything else to what the individual is actually telling you in real life. And then claim three, that the program design should be different, fundamentally different between novices, intermediate, and advanced. I do not think that's true either. I think generally programming heuristics are what they are. And so how the formulation and the dose changes is specific to the individual and is not informed by classifying somebody as novice, intermediate, advanced. And so I can reject the NIA framework and push even further to say you shouldn't use it prescriptively, which is my real problem with it. If the framework was just you get faster gains earlier on, slower gains later on, we wouldn't make this episode. But that's not how people are using it in practice. They're using it for progression models and prescriptive stuff for programming. And I think both of those things should be stopped. Austin, anything you want to add to this before we wrap up?
I think you put a button on it nicely, and I look forward to never having to make this argument again.
So that's the case against the novice, intermediate, advanced framework. And that's where the practical work starts. Here's what we want you to walk away with. The framework gets the observation right, but the conclusion wrong. Beginners do gain quickly. Advanced lifters do gain slowly. That part really is in dispute. What's wrong is the inference that the rate difference reflects categorically different biology that has to be programmed differently. The same 4 adaptive systems are running at year 1 and at year 10. What changes across a training career is the absolute size of each gain, the band of noise within the measurement, and how long you've got to watch your results before you know whether the work that you've just done is showing up. Now, those 4 systems are running on 4 different time scales, and that's the structural reason new lifters get hurt 3 to 10 times more often than experienced lifters in the same sport. Their muscles and nervous systems are responding on a faster clock than their tendons and bones. So a loading schedule built around the muscle's pace tends to overrun the connective tissue underneath it. The framework's prescription that novices should add weight every session because their biology, quote, supports it, is the same loading schedule that turns into patellar tendinopathy 4 months in. And most of the cultural language around fatigue, the CNS fried claims and the max recoverable volume as a number claim, doesn't survive contact with the data. Fatigue is at least 4 dissociable phenomena. The same recovery physiology runs in the new lifter and in the trained lifter once the first few weeks of the repeated bout effect resolve. And RPE is a calibration skill rather than a property that emerges from training years. A single hard squat session, as best as the data can tell us right now, doesn't fry your motor cortex. Which brings us to what to actually do when you're not getting results. The environment comes first. That means sleep, nutrition, and life stress. And if any of those are off, the move is to fix the input before you change anything with the program. If you can't fix them, yes, then you should adjust the program down because you're not in a good place to train as hard as you want to right now. If the environment is intact and the numbers are still flatlining, the question is whether you're carrying too much fatigue or you're carrying not enough training stress. Too much fatigue tends to look like constant soreness, a session RPE that's constantly above 8, and motivation that's drifting down. And the first move there is to drop a set or 2 on each exercise for a few training days and to see what happens to performance. Too little stress looks like the opposite. The soreness is gone, your session RPE is consistently below 6, and the weight on the bar is still flat. First move there is to check your exercise selection to make sure it's specific enough to how you're evaluating strength, and then to consider raising the average intensity, then potentially raising volume. The Training Plateau Action Plan walks through this whole sequence with specific decision points, and it's free, by the way. A genuine stall is worth investigating, but it's got to be defined by load and environment, not necessarily the calendar. The within-session diagnostic is the reference warm-up set that we talked about earlier. The across-block diagnostic is a 3 to 4 week trend in your estimated 1 rep max against a recent anchor. None of those rules change with training history. What changes is the size of the increment that clears the noise and how long you have to wait to see it. Now, if the categories describe a measurement window more cleanly than they describe biology, then most program hopping is a response to a fictional transition. Your training didn't stop working because the program got mismatched to a new physiology. Your gain stopped clearing the session-to-session detection threshold, and switching programs is solving a measurement problem with a training intervention. 2 different problems, and conflating them is where the NIA framework does its most consistent damage. A question to chew on before next week. If you've ever had a conversation about low testosterone with a doctor or with a friend, did anyone ask about body fat, about sleep, about the signal coming down the chain that tells the testes what to do? Or did the conversation start and end at a number on a lab report? Next week, we get into the drivers, the actual reason a man's testosterone ends up where it is, which almost always lives upstream of the testes themselves. The aromatase loop and the inflammatory cytokines from excess body fat are the pieces of the story most readers have probably already run across, but there's a third piece that almost nobody appreciates, and it sits at the very top of the HPG axis. It's a hormone you've probably heard about in the context of appetite, except the appetite story doesn't really hold up the way it's been sold. The rule for that hormone that does hold up tells you why an individual with obesity, well, their hypothalamus stops sending the signal his testes need to do their job. The hormone is leptin, and most clinicians have never connected it to low testosterone at all. That's where we'll be at next week. Everything we covered today, the 4-system model, the IPF data, and the warm-up diagnostic comes from work we've been pulling together for our broader progressive loading project. The 3-part article series is on barbellmedicine.com with all of the citations. The Training Plateau Action Plan is the diagnostic walked through step by step, and it's a free resource also on our website. Plus, we have the Barbell Medicine programs and one-on-one coaching are there when the answer needs to be more tailored to the individual. Leave us a 5-star rating and a review. It's the single best thing that you can do so that we can keep bringing you all the latest nuance in health and fitness. I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. That's Dr. Austin Baraki. We'll catch you next week and every week right here on the Barbell Medicine Podcast.